mark Black History Month, a moment when across this nation we pause to reflect upon the achievements, history, and struggles of African Americans. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank my colleagues in American University's Center for Israel Studies, Michael Brenner, who holds the Lillian and Seymour Abedson Chair in Israel Studies and directs our center, and Laura Cutler, our managing director, for enabling us to convene this conversation and to reach a wide audience of students, faculty, alumni, scholars, and friends on our campus and around the world. I also have a few housekeeping items before we begin. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and a link will be made available afterwards on our webpage. American University attempts to make its programs accessible to all. It is possible for anyone watching to activate closed captions live subtitles by clicking the CC button, the closed caption button that you should see at the bottom of your screen. If anyone has technical difficulties during the webinar, please email Eric Gordon, egordon@american.edu, or contact him through the chat. However, when you're posting your questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's panelists. Professor Lewis R. Gordon is head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, and honorary professor in the Unit for the Humanities at Rhodes University in South Africa. In previous positions, he founded Brown University's Department of Africana Studies and Temple University's Center for Afro-Jewish Studies and its Institute for the Study of Race and Social Thought. The author or editor of more than 15 books and almost 100 academic articles, might be more than 100 by now. His latest title is Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. Next year, the prestigious press Farrar, Straus and Giroux will publish his new book, Fear of Black Consciousness. Laura Arnold Liebman is a professor of English and Humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, where it is still very early in the morning. Her latest book, The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects, swept this year's National Jewish Book Awards, winning in the 3 categories of American Jewish Studies, History, and Women's Studies. An earlier book, Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism, won an Association for Jewish Studies Jordan Schnitzer Book Award and a National Jewish Book Award. In August, her new book, Once We Were Slaves, The Extraordinary Journey of a Multiracial Jewish Family, which is about an early multiracial Jewish family who began their lives enslaved in the Caribbean and became some of the wealthiest Jews in New York, will be published by Oxford University Press. I am especially delighted to welcome Kelly Whitehead back to her alma mater. In 2015, Ms. Whitehead earned her BA in our Department of History. Following graduation, she worked as the Youth Engagement Specialist at Washington, D.C.'s Temple Sinai. As a participant in the reform movement's Jew v. Nation, Jew of Color Fellowship, she created anti-racial bias training for Jewish professionals, and now, as a rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, she continues this important work. She also serves on the board of T'ruah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. Our conversation will be moderated by my terrific American University colleague, Dr. Lauren Strauss. Dr. Strauss is scholar in residence and director of undergraduate studies in our Jewish Studies program. She co-edited with Professor Michael Brenner, Meeting Modernity, Challenges and Trends in the Jewish Encounter with the Modern World, and she is finishing a new book, Painting the Town Red, Jewish Visual Artists, Yiddish Culture, and Radical Politics in Interwar New York. Her public history work includes Cleveland's Maltz Museum and the forthcoming Capitol Jewish Museum, where she is senior historical consultant. Thank you all for making the time to join us today. I turn our program over to Dr. Strauss and our panelists.
Thank you so much, Pam. And thank you to Michael Brenner Director of the Center for Israel Studies, for co-hosting this with the Jewish Studies program, and to the incredible Laura Cutler, who just organizes everything for all of us, always. I'm really, really excited that in particular that these three panelists could join us, because this is such an important issue and it's on so many people's minds. And I think that we're really going to get an exciting multiplicity of perspectives from our panelists. So I want to start, as I told them in advance, hearing from them sort of a prepared statement from each of our panelists, just for about 5 minutes each, and then I will ask them a series of questions before we open it up to audience Q&A. And I want to hear from each of you. We want to hear from each of you, please. A reflection on how you arrived at your interest in this subject and this important topic of Jews of color, or your involvement in this issue. And also, I was wondering, of course, how have the events of 2020, of the spring and summer of last year, changed your perception of the scope or the urgency of this issue? So going from directions on my Zoom screen, I'll start with Dr. Gordon. So Louis Gordon, please take us away.
Well, thank you, Lauren. To everybody in the audience, good morning, shalom. And I would also like to add, given the pandemic and a lot of other difficult things we're all going through, I extend my condolences to those of you who have lost loved ones. In addition to that, Purim's coming up. And I bring this up mainly because as we're dealing with struggles and despair, it's very important to have moments of joy. They remind us of our humanity. And so when you do get into your costumes and you reflect about moments of triumph, please do that with full, just throw yourself into it, because it's very important each day to garner that strength. Now, that initial question, just very quickly, I never planned at all to be a person who ended up talking about this subject matter. Most Jewish people are just simply Jewish people living our lives. And one of the things that led to me getting into this area of research was actually when I became an academic. I didn't study to do work in Jewish thought. It's just that I noticed in the response when I would mention being Jewish, it made it very clear to me that not only a lot of people don't know Jewish history and don't know Jewish people, but there are a lot of Jews who don't know Jewish history and a lot of Jews who don't know Jewish people. Now, that may sound like a very odd statement to make, but the short version of that is that most people think their Jews are the Jews. So because a lot of people use themselves as the indexical point, they immediately erase many others. What's striking, of course, is even a person as myself, who has always grown up with an understanding of a Jewish world that in today's language would be very multiracial. It's striking the extent to which one begins to do the same thing. In other words, I grew up looking at Jews the way my family were Jews, the way the communities of Jews I was from were Jews. And within that framework, I began to understand that would lead to blind spots. There was a book I wrote, for instance, in which I wasn't thinking about Jewish at all. And a commentator wrote that it's a book in African-American Judaism. And I said, what are you talking about? And so I went back and I reread the book, my book. And he was absolutely correct. It was just saturated with Jewish thought throughout. Now, that we are to speak for a very brief moment, so in the discussion I could elaborate some of this. But the thing that I would like to say is that as I began to now rethink from that moment of awakening, going through, looking deeply into the understanding of Jewish history, Jewish thought, and the complexity of Jewish peoples, there are things that I discovered that, for want of better expression, basically turned a lot of the world upside down. And so for me, for instance, as a person who's Black and Jewish, there are sometimes people treat that as if it's supposed to be a tension. But that's because a lot of people don't know actual Jewish history, particularly its foundations in East Africa. And one of the things that pop up, especially in a course I'm teaching right now, I'm teaching a course on African philosophy. There are students in my class who are Jewish who are just shocked as we go through the language and the history, for instance, ancient languages like Medu Neter, at how much of it is connected to what they've learned as Jewish history. With regard to the events of last year, anybody who has been looking at these issues politically, etc., would not be surprised about the events of last year. But you should bear in mind that the way I go through the study of Jewish history does not exclude the history of colonialism in Jewish history, how imperialism affected Jewish history. The very fact that race and racism are intimately connected to Jewish history, precisely because even the concept race was actually inaugurated to differentiate Afro-Muslims and Jews from European Christians. So when you bring all that together, when we are dealing with a background of simultaneously dealing with anti-Black racism and replete with dealing with the hatred of Jews, right? Always knowing what about anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. The events of last year did not surprise me at all. But what is something crucial to think about is something a little different internal to Jewish communities, which is we begin to see some of the contradictions that emerge when there's a pressure for Jewish whiteness. Because Jewish whiteness requires a form of investment in certain practices that require rewriting Jewish history and actually erasing some of the very important ways in which Jews, and when I say Jews here, I don't only mean Ashkenazi Jews, I mean Jews all over the world, are part of a very important question about we deal with issues of liberation. So I will say more later because my colleagues on the screen need to speak and we'll have some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. That's so profound. I can't wait to hear more from you. Laura, you are next in the row on my Zoom screen, so please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Louis, for setting things up that way. I'm not sure I'll be able to match the way that you've been able to position things in terms of what's going on with ourselves today. But I echo what you're talking about in terms of this just being a hard time for everybody, I think, and in different ways. And maybe as a moment when, for me at least, like empathy seems like such a huge part of like every starting point. For me, there's a way in which the work that I'm doing right now on this family that began their lives enslaved in Barbados and trying to use their story as they move around the Atlantic world to think about the history of early American Jews who had ties to Africa in terms of their ancestry throughout the Atlantic world, not just in one place, is really, in some ways, very much part of what I do as an early Americanist. I began my career in Native American studies. So for me, that intersection of race and religion seems natural, but it's a project also that is super personal in a way and comes out of some of my experience just as a Jewish mother and human being. So I've been working on this book for about 8 or 9 years. And one of the early sort of instigation points for me was when we were on a Fulbright in the Netherlands. My children were at 2 different Jewish schools. One was much more diverse than the other one. But one of the days when I was at the school that was more diverse, we were supposed to be reading books to our child, which was already like a bad moment for me because my Dutch pronunciation is horrible. So there I am in the like preschool classroom with the little book going like, oh no. But I also got handed a book, which then just made me like think like, oof, And it was a book on Swartza Pete, which is this Black caricature, this enslaved figure who helps out Santa Claus. And I was like, one, what is this doing in a Jewish school library? But also like, what were they thinking? Like, even in the US, there would have been that moment of like, oh, it might not be there because it was about Santa Claus. But I felt like there's that moment of like, what's going on in the teachers' minds about Judaism, that their only presentation of Blackness in the classroom is something both caricatured and is totally Christianized at the same time. And for me, this was so painful because I was actually there at a Fulbright teaching about the history of early Suriname and the early Caribbean, which had, for example, in Suriname, the community, one scholar's estimated, about half of the community has at least one African ancestor from this time period. And indeed, some of the kids in the classroom were descendants of that community. And I just felt like, as a parent, what would it be like to be the parent of those children? But also, what is it like as the parent of my child being raised to think about Judaism as the history in those terms? So this sort of ended up being a long journey of me writing a lot of failed children's books, trying to rethink it, but also trying to think about how I could write a history that would not just be for academics, but also sort of think about how do we rethink what Jewish community has been over the course of time, and how that community has always been incredibly diverse, and how did those histories get erased from our standard narrative. So for me, a lot of it really has to do with thinking about rethinking what sources were being abandoned in order to create that very white narrative for American Jewish history. From your second question about right now, I would say in some ways the urgency for me, again, as a parent, I feel like is always there, because whenever I go into the classroom to teach, I'm constantly, as a result of that experience and other experiences, trying to make sure that I bring a multitude of different characters who are coming in from the past that will allow a diversity of representations for the children to be thinking about. But also during the last summer, things were so volatile in the Portland community, where finally people were realizing, what does it mean to be a good ally? Should I be out there? Should I be protesting? We had protests, as many people know, throughout the summer. And it became, even within the Orthodox community, very much a flashpoint about what are our obligations to the entire Jewish community, who's being forced to leave behind parts of their identity in order to feel like they belong to Jewishness. And so for me, again, a sort of hope that by writing a history that will speak to academics, but also be legible to people more broadly, that maybe it can start a discussion of, there's a way in which that institutionalized racism that goes on in Jewish communities today has a long legacy, just like the people that I'm talking about were so important for early civil rights movements and have moments of great heroism. They had real struggles in terms of the Jewish community and what they were forced to leave behind in their identities. And I feel like those challenges and triumphs in the past are super important for understanding what's going on today as well.
Wow. I'm more and more excited and happy every minute that I'm listening to you both so far, two of you that we invited you today. And Laura, you actually made a perfect segue for us to go to Kelly, because you bring up the issue of generations and the fact that it's not just a matter for people who are in it and have been living this conversation, these thoughts for their whole lives, for many decades, but thinking about either their own children or their students or people to come. What is the narrative going to be like for the future of the United States, of the American Jewish community, of the world Jewish community? And Kelly, you're it. You are part of the future more than any of us. So
yeah, sure.
No pressure though.
No pressure. Yeah.
All on your shoulders.
No, I very much grew up a product of a the Reform Jewish movement. I went to a Reform synagogue and Reform summer camp and part of Reform fellowships, very much in this world. And growing up, I felt a real sense of pride of the emphasis that my community had on Tikkun Olam, on the sense of repairing the world and on social justice. When I was working in DC, I was so proud of the rabbis who were, especially after 2016, arrested, protesting against ICE and being arrested and really standing up for what they believe in. And all this was happening at the same time where I felt sort of oppressed within the Jewish space, or I felt really unwelcome as a Jew of color. And this experience I found as I got to know other Jews of color was more universal. Um, and I was, like teaching these teens that I was working with the importance of social justice and tikkun olam, and realizing that this talk of oppression and whiteness is really missing from our spaces. So one way I think that we can start talking about oppression and whiteness and how that overlaps within Jewish spaces is by learning about our community and learning more about what our tradition says of social justice, learning what our tradition says about welcoming all people. So I wanted to be a rabbi. I wanted to go to school which I'm doing right now, to study our tradition, to study our text, and to be a leader in a space where I find there aren't many other leaders that look like me. So I am becoming a rabbi. So one, I can be a role model for those Jews of color who are out there, because according to the Jew of Color Initiative, 12 to 15% of Jews in the United States are Jews of color. But if you look at our Jewish communities, at our spaces, you notice that it doesn't look like 12 to 15% of our Jewish communities are Jews of color, to which there's some pushback to this research that says that can't be possible. That's not true, but I believe it is true. And this 12 to 15% are not present because they're not welcome. And it's not because we're putting a sign on our door that says, Jews of color are not welcome here. It's the actions of the members in our community. And these actions are not always explicit bias. They're not saying you can't come here because you look different. Instead, what Jews of color are experiencing at a very high level are microaggressions. And these are acts and insults and slights and other examples of language or even body language, verbal or physical language, that make Jews of color and other minority groups feel less than. So an example of this that I've experienced, I'm not going to only share about my own experience because it's hard to put a Jew of color on a spotlight and make them share all the times that they felt less than. It's challenging, and I'm not going to go into that too much. And I also want to say that I cannot speak for all Jews of color, just as I can't speak to Lewis's experience. I can only speak to my own experience, and we all have different experiences for many different reasons. So when I walk into a synagogue and someone hands me their plate as if I'm custodial staff, because they assume just because I have darker skin than others that I'm a custodial staff member, that makes me feel like I'm not seen as a member of the community in the same way. Or when I walk into a Jewish space and someone wants to know, oh, how am I Jewish? But that's not a question that maybe the other white people hear. White people don't ask each other, I think, oh, how are you Jewish? In the first example of meeting. Instead, if we opened our doors to our community and said, oh, how are you today? Instead of how are you Jewish, then maybe Jews of color will feel more welcome, because it doesn't matter. You don't need to know how a person is Jewish. You don't need to know whether they're a Jew by choice. You don't need to know if they're born Jewish, if their dad's Jewish, if their mom's Jewish. That's not important to you welcoming them in for Shabbat. And these microaggressions, every time you hear one of them, is sort of like a paper cut. And so if I walk in the door and someone tries to explain something to me, that's a paper cut. Or then I get confused as custodial staff, that's another paper cut. And all of a sudden I'm bleeding to death, or I have to tend all these stinging wounds, and I can't be in the Jewish space for what I wanted to do, which is to pray, to eat the snacks, to nosh and schmooze and like get to know the other people in these spaces. So that to me is something that has been brought to the front since 2020, since last summer. And I think the Jewish community since last summer has felt a bit of pressure to act and to perform, to bring in, Jew of color speakers, to host panels. But what I think has to change, or what I've noticed is since the summer, it's lost its popularity. It's lost bringing in Jews of color or bringing in diversity or working on ourselves has kind of been less important since the summer. And I think that's a problem because I don't think bringing in speakers is going to get rid of racism and microaggressions. What I think is really important for this issue is that every single member of the Jewish community, every single member has to look into themselves, into a cheshbon nefesh, a soul searching, in order to find their biases. Because I have lots of biases, everyone has lots of biases. But if we look into ourselves and learn that we are constantly on a path to becoming better people, and that to me is essentially Jewish, then we can really make change within our community.
Wow, thank you. You bring up an issue that also Louis spoke to. He used the word identity. You used words about identity, and also Laura, you did as well. And also Kelly, you bring up this really interesting, somewhat surprisingly controversial discussion about counting, right? About what percentage of the Jewish community is Jews of color. And there have been some real, harsh words and conflicts about this. So one thing that I would like to ask you all to just jump in, whenever you, want to respond to a question now, is what is this terminology? Sometimes it is self-chosen. Someone identifies as a Jew of color. Is it necessarily someone who's clearly African-American? What happens when you're Persian? When your background is Persian, or if you're Asian, or if you're Greek Jew, or if you're part, there are all sorts of different forms. And also, of course, we're talking mostly today about the American Jewish community, which is unique in a lot of senses. And I would like you, if you feel comfortable, if you're familiar with the makeup of other Jewish communities, especially Israel, those words and those concepts have really different ramifications, because in Israel, for instance, the majority of the population of Jews in Israel is arguably made up of Jews of color, if you include so-called Mizrahi Jews, which now I've learned the other day on a different panel about Jews of color in Israel. Some people feel that the word Mizrahi, or Eastern Jews, is an artificial construction because it just throws together almost everyone who's not Ashkenazi. And even within countries, there are huge differences between the historical communities of Jews in Morocco and India, etc. So first of all, how do you all define, not how do you personally define, but how does the community arrive at a workable definition? And how is it that America has its own, unique issues in this realm? So I don't know who wants to respond to that first. Louis?
Well, sure. Well, we have a short time, but there are a lot of issues that converge there. Okay, so I apologize to the audience that I'm going to have to make it very condensed. Okay, one of the things we have to bear in mind is that just as we just saw the disinformation and misinformation campaigns under the Trump administration, this is how fascism works. Okay. We human beings are designed for hypnosis. Whenever people are trying to learn something, I always say to my students, make sure you do it 3 times in a row. If you do it 3 times in a row, your brain suddenly wants the 4th time. And so if you repeat a lie 3 times, it begins to function as a truth by the 4th. Why I say this is because a lot of propaganda has misrepresented Jewish history to Jewish people. And when people get to learn that history, especially around issues of race, right, we have things turn around. For instance, even when I introduced myself, I was born in Jamaica, and my mother was Jewish on both sides, right? Her father's side was what we call Mizrahi Jews. They were from Jerusalem, okay, and in the 19th century, okay. And my mother's side were Sephardic Jews from Ireland, okay. Now, the thing about it, there a lot of people, even today, people would presume Irish Jews as Ashkenazi, but they were Sephardic, you see? But now things have been rewritten in such a way that anybody who's in Europe who's Jewish is called Ashkenazi. Now, I bring this up merely because what many people today don't realize is that a very short time ago, there were no white Jews. To be Jewish was not to be white. And in fact, even in the US, the history books, the first recorded Jew was a man by the name of Solomon, arrested for working on the Sabbath in New Hampshire because it was the Christian Sabbath, Sunday. And his argument was, I'm not a Christian. But he was arrested as a Black person. You see what I'm getting at? And historically, even when I give lectures across the globe, even when I'm in the UK, I've given lectures in front of large groups of what in this country would be called white Jews, when I mentioned to them that I grew up where even the palest looking Jewish person will never say the words I'm white. They exhale and said, somebody's finally talking the truth, okay? So the first thing to bear in mind is where did this whiteness thing come from to normativize it in such a way that people who don't identify as white are being asked, are you Jewish? And that comes from an effort to try to conflate, right? In fact, it comes from an investment in a project of making Jews white. And to bear in mind, this is where it gets really complicated. And again, I'm just going to be short, but when colonialism came about, right, Euromodern colonialism, a lot of the colonies were outnumbered by people of color, whether they're the indigenous people or the African enslaved. And there became a need, a very project of a constructed whiteness. And what began to happen is people who are not white in Europe had a doorway to become white in the colonies. But what became very complicated in many of the colonies is because, you see, Jews as a category were not actually as a religious category. And the thing about it is that a lot of the colonies began to disaggregate things where you could have a religion and a race. And so for European Jews, who some in cases are darker than I am, a context in which if you made your identity fundamentally Jewish, you can now have a religion. And the question is, what was your race? And in a country that says it'll protect your religion, but not your race, you needed to fuse your race with your religion in a way that would make it white. And so if you look at a lot of the past in the United States, and if you look at a lot of America, just even the wonderful book that Laura, Leibman is working on, you would find in the Caribbean, Latin America, many of the other places, Jewish communities would just say we're Jews, but that meant not being white, you see? So for instance, even in my childhood, when I thought about being Jewish, it wasn't as a religion. It was in the United States I had to learn what things I was already doing that were called religion. You see what I'm getting at? It would be like a Yoruba or an Igbo, or if you're a person who's Tamil coming here, and now you have to rewrite yourself as a religion. And so the short version of it is that the fact of the matter is, to make whiteness seductive, you have to give some perks. And so there are people who, in an effort to become white, became such a part of the project to get what now slides into white supremacy, that it began to split many Jewish communities and rewrite our history. And those, particularly who are most vehement about becoming white, are the people in political terms who are called neoconservative Jews. And this became very tricky because you see a lot of people who are not neoconservative Jews, historically left or liberal, etc. If you look at that Jewish history, it's in today's language, rich with what's called miscegenation. And in fact, there's always been this question of a fusion, right, of Jewish active work that was constantly transforming Jewish communities, as linked to what Kelly talked about with Tikkun Olam. The idea that you're fighting for justice in such a way that was more inclusive. And so it made Judaism something that was generative. Neoconservatism wanted to create a purification model. And that purification model was premised upon whiteness, and began to push in such a way this problem, in such a way that in some places it so pushed away so many Jewish people that the people who now self-declare, they declare themselves authentically Jewish by virtue of white, began to be linked to white power, and has begun to do something that is very destructive in Jewish communities. And it becomes even more so when the US context, as imperial, imposes that model globally. Anyway, I'll stop there because I know my colleagues have more to say.
I actually, that you gave us so much to think about with that topic that I want to throw a couple of more topics into the mix before we get to audience questions. I have a question that I'm particularly interested in hearing how Laura answers this, and that is about history. We're historians. So we hear when we discuss this issue of so-called Black Jewish relations, which was the more reductive way of saying either Jews of color or people of color. We often hear about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, especially in the early to mid 1960s. The friendships between Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Heschel and Dr. Joachim Prince. We hear about the martyrdom, if you will, of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman in Mississippi, summer of '64. And then we hear about the so-called fraying of the alliance. And there's much hand-wringing over that. Recent scholarship is not only possibly reframing or adding to this narrative, but there have even been some real sort of brouhahas in the academic world recently about how to discuss these past relationships. And I'm wondering, in your mind, in your work, and in particular, Laura, I'm thinking of you because you work on such an earlier period, taking us back several centuries. How large does the history loom in terms of what we're discussing now, in terms of the importance? To what extent do we need to, or do we have a right to either rest on laurels or dig up past skeletons? How important, and I hesitate to ask this as an historian, how important is history in dealing with, all of the issues that we have to deal with now?
Sure. So maybe also to connect it to the question that Lewis was answering too, that I think one of the things that's so helpful about the earlier time period for the family that I'm working on, but for a lot of different people in the communities that they're sort of moving through, is that as they move around the Atlantic world, how race is constructed in each place is different. And so for one of the gentlemen in the family, he works some of the time in Barbados and some of the time in New York. And when he's in New York, he's a white person. And when he's in Barbados, when he goes back, he's reassigned, redesignated as a person of color again. So I think that sort of contingency of place can help us get at some of that social constructedness. And yet I always want to emphasize, like, you're not a free agent, even in the past, right? So when you look at the Jewish community of Suriname, they're constantly struggling against struggles within the Jewish community about the terms that they're going to use, where the people who are being designated people of color have a particular term they want because it implies certain rights and liberties. And the European Jews are constantly using the wrong term. So I feel like those sort of struggles of contingency of who gets to make decisions are always part of these power structures. In terms of that history of resting on our laurels, I feel like one of the things that comes out of the civil rights movements for the time period that I'm looking at is, as with today, not one Jew represents everybody, right? So like within a Jewish community, there's a bunch of people who are doing horrible, horrible things, and then other people who are actually doing things that are kind of helpful in terms of like trying to navigate what's going on in terms of bringing people in. So I feel like then often you'll see these struggles within the Jewish community of which side will get the number of votes needed in order to have a certain policy within the synagogue. So I feel like maybe that's a good reminder for us today too, that our agency is always limited, right? Like we have these social forces keeping us from being able to do exactly what we want. But at the same time, we also have some free will in order to be the kind of actors that we want to be, as opposed to feeling like I'm predetermined that I have to act in horrible ways all the time, right? So I feel like my guess is during the civil rights movement, Jews were also quite, in the US, were also split, right? That there are some Jews that you wouldn't want as role models and other ones maybe that you would. So we need to look back and be honest about not trying to make everybody in the past be everything to all of us all the time, right? But choosing the people who are going to be helpful for moving us forward. And again, I think that's where making a diversity of different voices is so important, right? If I only see one group being held up as the ideal, then I have weird expectations about like what it means to be ideal within a Jewish community. So the more variety of people I can see, like how were women influencing what's going on? How were people with Jews who were extremely poor at the time and had all these other things happening, how were they dealing with the struggles, as well as how were people who brought in non-European ancestry, how were they changing the dynamics of Jewish communities for the better, right? So I think that really can be an important way of thinking about just diversifying what we hold up as ideal, and also remembering that people chose an ideal for a reason, very much as Lewis was saying, for their own needs at a particular moment, and their needs may not be my needs.
That's for sure, right? Kelly, you know, you already are a rabbi in a lot of ways. I'll let my friends at HUC ordain you, but
Many years.
Really, the way that you're talking already, I feel like was very rabbinic. And you were filtering all of these issues that we started talking about through Judaism. And you kept referring to text and Judaism and Tikkun Olam, and which admittedly is often an overused phrase, but I think that you were using it certainly in the right context. And so it's clear that it seems clear in the 5 minutes I've known you, that you filter these things through a Jewish lens, meaning not a only culturally Jewish or only, gastronomically Jewish, but Judaism, Yadut, the text, the tradition. How are you going to do that? How are you going to use that huge tradition and use it to meet these struggles?
That's an excellent question that I wish I could answer. I'm still, not only do I have many, many more years of rabbinical school, but I still, I think it's a question that I will be asking myself always. I also want to speak to one of your earlier questions about comparing the nuances of race in Israel-Palestine with race in America, and it's almost impossible to do in a way because they are in different societies, and America specifically is built off of slavery, and it is a system that is in its core based on white supremacy, and it is nearly impossible to compare the same nuances of race, as I think Dr. Gordon was doing, with the rest of the world itself. And I also want to highlight the importance of intersectionality, this idea that by Kimberly Crenshaw, that you can belong to multiple groups at the same time, that just because I'm Black doesn't mean that I'm not also Jewish at the same time, or just it goes beyond race and religion. Like I'm also queer at the same time, that we as people don't only belong to one group at one time. And I guess also speaking to this idea of like systemic racism in the historical context, I think it is really important in a historical perspective to teach about the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, how 50% of the Freedom Riders are Jews, and the civil rights legislation was written in the room of the Religious Action Center. I think that's really awesome. And I also think that does not let us off the hook today in any sense of the word, in any sense whatsoever. I think we can have a sense of pride. And as Laura was hitting on as well, I think not every Jew was participating in the civil rights movement, because why would you fight against a system of oppression that white Jews are benefiting from? Like it doesn't always serve in their best interest to fight against white supremacy. And that doesn't mean that they are hooded and that they are KKK members, but it also um, means that we're in all spaces, white Jews are not always speaking up against oppression because it doesn't serve in their best interest, or they're so worried about having a burning cross on the front of their synagogue that they don't want to, support Martin Luther King speaking at the gathering of the Reform movement because they're worried about their own safety. And I also think that Lauren, you talked about the straying or the fraying of relationships after the civil rights movement, and that's because of many different reasons. One of which is after the war in 1967 in Israel-Palestine, and how the Black rights movements tended to side more with the Palestinian narrative of being oppressed, of losing your land and being forced to really lose these rights that are key. So of course the Black rights movements would side with the Palestinians in the first place, and so that's one of the reasons. And there's numerous reasons of why Jews, I guess, lost interest in the civil rights movement, or why the civil rights movement ended after a certain amount of time, or transformed, I shouldn't say ended, and that now I think thinking of in this post 2016 era of how I think Jews aren't having the seat at the table that they once did. For example, in Black Lives Matter, like I think there should be way more Jews present in these organizations, but they're not because of these nuances. One with Israel um, and other reasons why, the Black Lives Matter supports Palestinians. Like, that is not a reason to not agree that Black Lives Matter. It's the same concept of you can hold multiple ideas at the same time. You don't have to 100% agree with one organization and able to sign on to it, when the goal of that organization is to promote the safety and equality and the existence, acknowledge the existence and the importance of the existence of one community.
Can I say
Yeah.
something very briefly? Just three brief points, because the first one to bear in mind is that the thing about the right wing everywhere is that they're loud. And because they're loud, they often appear more than they actually are. And I say this because, you see, what I know, at least not only at a very active level, but historical level, also with research, most left-wing Jews never went anywhere. They've remained fighting for the rights of people beyond Jewish communities. Neoconservative Jews are very loud. And as a consequence, they often elide or cover over the fact that in many organizations across not only the United States, the Caribbean, all across the globe, there have been a continued effort. And in some, for instance, if you pick a very radical example, the Communist Party. The Communist Party has always had Jews and Black Jews and brown Jews, etc. I bring this up because when we bring up Black Lives Matter, what many people don't realize is Alicia Garza is Jewish. One of the founders of Black Lives Matter is a queer, intersected Jewish woman. And so those are issues that we should bring to the forefront. The second part I want to bring up very briefly is there is a certain logic in how race is brought up in Jewish discourses that is linked into recognition issues. And what many people who have identified as white I'm talking about white Jews who would, don't understand is that not every person who could be called a Jew of color is looking for recognition from these white Jews. If you're a devout person, for instance, if I pick a religious Jewish person of color, that person is going to continue just being religious, whether she or he or they are recognized or not. And if we bring among those who are secular, look, if you're born in a Jewish family, you could go say all kinds of things a lot. There's a world in which you're Jewish. And so the thing to bear in mind is that many of us are not actually looking for that recognition. And then the last part, I just want to just say very briefly, because I heard it in different elements here, is the importance of learning. And what I mean by that is I see Judaism as basically a lifelong commitment to continued learning. And of course, for continued learning, you have to admit you make mistakes. You make errors, things are going on. But the difference, of course, is the ethical issue, which is what Kelly is hinting at, is about how you respond to your errors. An unethical person will never, ever learn from an error because the person will never admit an error. But an ethical person says, okay, I made a mistake. What can I learn from this? And I'll just leave it at that because there's a lot more to say, but I'll just leave it at that.
Well, actually, I'm starting to look at the questions, and as a reminder to people listening, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Louis, one of the questions that we just got was, please ask Dr. Gordon, what are some texts that he might suggest to address this question of, let's see, as the person put it, the whiteification of Judaism, or I would say probably more of Jews. So if you want to either write something out or quickly tell us some titles and authors of sources that come to your mind, that would be great. Do you want to do that quickly, or which do you prefer?
I just got to talk a bit. Could we get to a question and get to Kelly and Laura,
Yeah,
and I'll
so
type
then
on the
you can
side.
think about that would be
Okay.
great. Thank you.
I can address this,
Yeah.
the latter part of the question of,
Mhm.
the latter part of the question is, it's vital that we deconstruct this dominant narrative and return to more accurate history. I think that the whiteification of Jewry is not something, for those who are white Jews, is not something that we need to deconstruct. I don't believe in that we need to make Jews not white again. I think that is how society views them, and that is how white Jews are seen in America, as just simply white. And I think instead of deconstructing that narrative, what I think needs to happen is this understanding of what it means to be white, what power comes from whiteness, understanding that privilege and learning how you can use that privilege and that power to make communities more safe or more welcoming for other people, or other things that we can do with our privilege. But that comes to owning the privilege and understanding that it exists, and going on from there. And my colleague here also mentioned that, so a good point, that not all Jews of color are trying to be welcome in white spaces. That's not everyone's priority, but I do believe that all communities should be at a point where they are inclusive and they do have a sense of belonging in case those people are there. I think that is a high standard in which our Jewish community should strive to meet.
Interesting. We also had a question specifically directed at Dr. Liebman. Laura, you of course are well known as a specialist in Suriname and the other communities, Barbados, the other communities of the Caribbean, where you're finding this remarkable material about the racial makeup and cultural makeup of the communities there. So one of our questioners would like you to explain sort of, a little bit more about the background, how this happened.
Sure. So maybe this sort of ties into some of the things that other people have been saying too. I think one of the big things that, well, I'll sort of speak to a couple of things. One is, I think it's really important to recognize that who has the right to decide where Jewishness comes from is important in this discussion. So I know, for example, descendants of the family that I'm working on did DNA studies, and their African ancestors are from the part of Africa that is associated with people who identified as being Jewish already. And so I think that definitely is something that we see going on in a number of the communities, and as part of the history that's kind of harder to trace. So you have a lot of people coming to the Americas already with some oral traditions about Jewishness, and that history sort of is behind some of what goes on in terms of legacies in the Caribbean as well as in the United States, right? So I feel like just that moment of like, who gets to make the decision of where Jewishness comes from is really important in that historical discussion. In terms of Suriname, one of the things that I think is super important for Suriname is that it's the location where there's an early semi-autonomous Jewish community where Jews are setting, white European Jews are setting the rules a little bit more than in other locations. And they very much are attempting to try and establish a new Jerusalem in that location. That said, it's also a place of incredible injustice. It's a plantation or a forced labor camp town. So there's inherently slavery in that location where Jews from Europe are the enslavers, but they make a very concerted effort to both convert people who are enslaved to them and also to circumcise people who are enslaved to them. And so we have a very much larger group of people entering into the Jewish community whose ancestors who had been enslaved than in other parts of the Caribbean. So that in terms of the halakhic, from the Western European mind of the halakhic Jewish community, there's a larger group of people with African ancestry in that community. And again, sort of recognizing some of those people may have already had ideas about Jewishness before they came to the Americas. So by the time period of the people that I'm looking at, people have been members of the Jewish community who had African ancestors for generations, right? So it's not like people are recent converts or anything like that. It's an ongoing thing. The way race is defined in Suriname is different than in Barbados. It's not a one-drop rule. So there's also a whitening of certain parts of that community. So Aviva Ben-Ur, who really is like the huge specialist on the Jewish community of Suriname, has estimated, we certainly know from colonial records that the colonial governments perceive their counting that at least 10% of the Jewish community are people they identify as Jews of color. But Aviva's estimated, based on sort of issues of how race works differently during that time period in Suriname, that probably about 50% of the community or more had at least one ancestor from Africa. So that becomes important. It's not like people just stay in Suriname. Suriname's a really important colony. People from Suriname become the religious leaders of many of the early congregations of the United States and become leading figures of early congregations in the United States. So you do see people sort of coming into the US from Suriname as well as to other parts of the Caribbean. So I don't know if that helps.
Wow, yeah, that is amazing. And my more general thought at hearing this is how much more is out there about other communities around the world that haven't yet found their scholars and their specialists. How much more are we going to learn in the coming years that perhaps people wouldn't have expected, that then in turn may contribute to reconfiguring some of the perceptions that people have. So having scholarship back it up. So we now know so much more about that area of the world, thanks to you and Aviva and others. But what other parts of the world and other histories of other communities are we going to learn about yet?
Yeah. And I would say, I think one thing too is that I definitely, and maybe this sort of gets back to Lewis's comment about always being in a process of learning. Like I always try to recognize too, like I bring my own baggage and my own experiences to the way that I filter the history, right? So people who have different lived experiences and different ways of understanding the world around them are going to also bring different eyes, and they're going to read different texts and notice things that I'm missing based on where I'm coming from. So I feel like yes, there'll be new sources and that's going to be amazing, but I also expect there's going to be another generation of scholars that will come and like look at the same text and be like, oh, how could she not have seen blank, 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 blank? So I think that's part of the way scholarship works too, right? That each of us has our own limits. We push things forward, but we have our limits too. And so I assume I'm flawed as a scholar in whatever ways that people are. So
interesting. So there have been a couple. First of all, Lewis Gordon has just on one foot has sent an incredible array of sources, and I think maybe what we'll do is send that out to participants, to people who had the link when the center sends the link to everybody, the recording. If we have time at the end, we'll read some of them out loud. Is that okay?
Sure. One thing I just say very just very quickly, a great place to start is Jewish cookbooks.
Oh, yeah.
And in the thing, I just mentioned why, because you see, when people recipe, it sets things back. But when you look at the stories around the recipes, you see Jewish diversity writ large.
It's also more fun. I mean, because then at the end you eat. So a number of people, shouldn't be a total loss. So a number of people have pointed to something that Kelly brought up about the kind of the delicate dance of finding out about somebody's personal background. And you just gave us a few examples of what I don't know if I would call microaggressions. I mean, some of those are searing experiences, being handed a plate, etc. And so we're hearing both from people who have had similar experiences as people of color, as Jews, as people who consider themselves white and are Jewish and experienced anti-Semitism, etc. And they're saying, and some people are saying that they love to know about other people's stories to connect, to make themselves feel more seen or more as more of a community. And so a few people have asked, what is the right way? When is the right moment to ask somebody, not to walk up to someone who's Black and in a synagogue and say, hey, what are you doing here? But what way is there to learn about people's stories, to kind of create a conversation?
Yeah, I think it's on each individual. I cannot speak to every individual and how they like, but if you walk up to a person of color, you're not going to say, "Hey, what are you doing here?" But you're going to, as we have this culture of politeness, we're going to assume that maybe that person um, doesn't belong or hasn't been there before, and be really nice about it. And that's why I think microaggressions sting the most, is because on the surface they're really nice, but deep down they're not so nice. So the biggest piece of advice that I can give is get to know the person for literally any other reason, and they can volunteer that information to you, because you do not need to know that information. You can be curious. I think that's fascinating. I think we should try to get to know everyone, but I think you can first ask, how is their day? If once we eat together again, you can ask them, oh, what food did they like? Or are have they been to this book club, or have they read a new book about the early Jews in the Americas? It's really fascinating. I was just on a panel and learned about it. Like that, you can simply get to know a person for who they are. And it kind of I think hovers on this idea of color blindness, which is that, oh, I don't care if you're white or Black or green or purple. And when we say things like that, we're denying a person's experiences, and we're denying their existence. So when you're saying, oh, I don't, this is a very, very, very fine line that we have to walk. And it takes practice. And one of my colleagues here mentioned that, a big part of learning is knowing when you made a mistake, and then learning from that mistake. So you don't have to get it right, but I think we need to find the balance of just simply getting to know a person for who they are, but in the back of your head, keeping in mind, okay, what am I saying to this person, so that I see them, I hear them, but I'm not coming off in any way that could be offensive. And that takes a lot of practice. I also want to remind everyone this concept of intersectionality, of how I can be both Black and Jewish, is the same way that people can be both white and Jewish. You can have your own experiences of anti-Semitism and still at the same time be a perpetrator of bias. Or I can, be non-binary, I can be Black, I can be Jewish, and I can still, I have many times assumed that a woman in my space was the nurse and not the doctor. There's many ways, because it's in the air we breathe. That's Beverly Tatum. This this idea that there's bias, and that we're always there's an idea that we're socialized to breathe in racism, and we're socialized to breathe in sexism, and think less of minority groups, or people of marginalized identities, because that is the society that we're a part of. So it's on all of us to unlearn that, while also holding on to our own identities.
It's a constant process. So someone sent me a fairly provocative question / statement. This person writes about what they call the Jew of color movement. that there's division as to who is included in that term. Are Sephardic Jews considered Jews of color, et cetera? And bringing out that a number of American Jewish organizations recently have announced that they're creating new cohorts, training cohorts, specifically for Jews of color only. Homes, homes for people in their 20s, post-college, to do certain training programs, opening one for Jews of color only. And again, how people are self-defining, et cetera. And the person writes, it seems like 15 years ago, it was all about, quote, big tent Judaism and reaching out and including everybody. And now the community has decided it's better to highlight differences that rather than push for inclusivity. And also, I hope that Black, Latino, Asian, and Sephardic Jews are gaining the acceptance and support they feel they need and becoming a bridge between Jews, et cetera. It's a long question, but it's a really interesting issue, right? To what extent do you want people to feel like they're with other people who have had similar experiences and feel supported that way? And to what extent is that not always the best strategy? So what do you think? I'll start with Louis.
Well, one of the things we should understand is that there's a tendency to treat racial terms with symmetry. So people, when they say white and black, it's not really that there are two sides of something that's the same. Race is very asymmetrical. When Laura, for instance, was talking about a person in Barbados who travels to the US, everybody in my family, when we travel, we are race changers, because we are designated one way in one country, one place, and different in another. Even with me right now, the way I'm not called white, but I've been many designations. And what's interesting related to Kelly's point is a lot of them all are true. I've left the airport in Kennedy, a Black person, landed in Abu Dhabi, a Tamil, and landed in India, an Arab, and they're all true. They're all my background, and the list goes on. And it's, yes, the thing about the human world is you could be 100% of more than one thing, so to speak. But here's the crucial point. Here's the big difference. If you go to Black countries, right, and you could see this in the Caribbean, when countries have a Black national identity, they are actually, interestingly enough, more inclusive, because the lighter people can still have the identity. The whitest looking Jamaican is a Jamaican and has a Black identity. But if you go to the Latin Caribbean, where there's a mestizo or a white national consciousness, there tends to be a separation. Now, the United States is a white supremacist country. And because of that, it defines whiteness as a purity, that is where the exclusivity comes in. Now, what the thing historically that's very different is that, you see, if you say color, it makes people ask questions in a very different way. People used to ask me, why didn't I call the center I'd created, the Center for Afro-Jewish Studies, why didn't I call it the Center for Jewish Diversity? And I said, it's because a lot of people think to be diverse as a Jew is just to say Sephardic, you know what I mean, Mizrahi, or in some cases, they would even use the category disabled, you see? But so I said I wanted something that would make people ask the question more. And because there's such an anxiety, such an issue about being Black in this country, if you say Afro and Jewish, it makes people, they always said the same thing. Do you mean Black and Jewish relations? I said, no. Do you mean, and then finally they have to think about Jewish history in a different way. But the thing is, you see, there are Jews who are of color, but who are not Black. And many communities wanted to find a way to put, the off-color movement actually came more in the 80s. And the thing about it is that it came more out of college campuses. And what it was to realize that in very white spaces, although the experiences may not be identical for the different communities of color, a certain conversation that's needed, because separately, each group is very tiny. And so that coalition was to create a sufficient political statement to bring in a very forceful way a conversation like what we're having now. And it's not a closed conversation. It's actually the beginning of a conversation.
Right. That's a more positive way of looking at it. So we only have about 3.5 minutes left. So I'm just going to throw out there, I looked through the questions. We got a ton of wonderful questions and comments. A lot of them, not surprisingly, ask, where do we go from here? How can people help? People ask about how in our synagogues, if you're Jewish and you belong to a synagogue, how can that space be changed? In museums and museum exhibits and public education. Someone asked an interesting question about the census form, being forced to choose one identity. And of course, there's education and anti-racism efforts in general. And then the last is in academia and scholarship, the fact that we've all acknowledged already today that these things aren't so easy, in that the discussion in America is very different from the discussion in Israel. And that I heard a woman, an Ethiopian Israeli woman, on a webinar last week say that she was never Black until she got to Israel. She was Jewish in Ethiopia and she's Black in Israel. So there's a lot to be done. So just very quickly, if people could respond and think of one or two really important things that they could suggest for people to start to move the needle. Kelly, I want to start with you.
Great. I'm also going to go back and address the last question about how these communities are forming affinity spaces. And affinity spaces are where people share similar identities. So like the Moishe House you mentioned, it doesn't feel great when you're not invited to sit at the table, but it's really helpful for people in marginalized groups to be in spaces where they're not worried about these paper cuts. They're not worried about these microaggressions. And so by creating affinity spaces, which people find uncomfortable because it reminds them as forced segregation, but in reality, it's like a way for people to take their back off, the way for people who identify as their backpack off, for people who identify as Jewish, how maybe they feel more comfortable in Jewish spaces than in schools when they're the only Jewish student. One thing we can do is, where are we giving our tzedakah? Where are we donating money? Are we donating our money to Black organizations or different organizations? Are we being upstanders? That means in a situation where there's a bully and a victim, the upstander is the one who says something, who, if someone witnesses bias, I ask that like the white people stand up for the people of color, so that it's not only the burden is not only on the people of color to change what they're doing, and to not only just hold up a mirror on yourself and your own biases, but really look deeply in your soul to understand how you can unlearn all these things that have been learned. What are you reading? Who are you talking to? What are your focus groups? There's plenty of solutions. It's all up to yourself and what you need.
Thank you. And Kelly, I have to add, a lot of the comments are from your AU fans and people who miss you from when you were here. Laura, quick ideas.
Yeah, to build off of some of the things that Kelly was saying, that I think as a scholar, and this sort of goes back to something I heard in one of the questions about wanting other people to be a bridge and serve as that bridge. And I do think there's something super important about taking on some of the bridge work as a white scholar, taking on some of that bridge work myself. Does that make sense? So I had a student at some point saying like, oh, I don't want to work on slavery for this because that's an African-American issue. It's like, whoa, slavery, that is a white problem, right? Like, it is on us to like deal with that legacy. It's not that I own it. It's not that I will understand everything about it, but man, do I have an obligation to grapple with that legacy, right? So I feel like there are ways in which both I need to come with it as it is on me to go out and learn as much as I can, and also to recognize that my learning will have limits. So that would just be sort of.
Thank you. Good nutshell. Louis, you're going to take us out.
Well, the short answer is to remember we're human beings. We're not gods. And these are struggles we can conduct one day at a time. And to do them one day at a time, we need to understand that it's about two very important elements. The first one is about love, and the second is about radical commitment. And what I mean by that, when I start with love, the mistake is if we have narcissistic love, we're only thinking about ourselves. We're not thinking about others. And so the action is only a constant repetition of the self. However, if we get over ourselves and we understand that others don't have to be like us for us to love and be committed to them, then we have radical love, because we understand our struggle is for something always greater than ourselves. And I think in Judaism, one of the best examples we could think of this is Moses. Remember, Moses didn't go into the promised land. Moses, in fact, right on the verge of it, died. But Moses and all of us should understand that when we're looking for a better world, we're looking for a world that we may not enter, but we hope in our struggles, those who do enter, look back and say thank you.
And thank you all. Thank you, our panelists. And I really want to thank everybody who we can't see out there, but who joined us. I look forward to seeing many of the same people join us and to continuing the conversation, because there's so much more to figure out and to learn from each other. So we're out of time, and stay well, stay safe. See you all soon. Bye.